Her brother satisfies himself with the entire fortune millions in real estate investment accounts and luxury properties across Northern Virginia. She inherited a single piece of land, 80 acres of silence, ruin, and debt in the Shenandoah Valley. But their grandmother had buried a secret inside that forgotten farmstead, a secret that would prove the real inheritance had nothing to do with money. This is that story. If you enjoy stories about family hidden truths and the kind of strength that only comes with age, take a moment now to subscribe and turn on notifications. New stories arrive every week, and this one is far from over. The morning of Vivienne Hollowell's funeral arrived, wrapped in the kind of autumn light that makes everything look like a memory. The sky over the Shenandoah Valley held low, the clouds sitting heavy against the Blue Ridge, as though the mountains themselves were pressing down on the day. A thin mist clung to the fields along Route 340, and the trees lining the church road had already begun to turn deep amber rust, a few early streaks of crimson bleeding through the green. Margery Hollowell sat in the first pew of the small stone church on the outskirts of Waynesboro. She was 63 years old. Her hands were folded in her lap, her posture straight, her expression composed in the way that grief sometimes demands. Not because the pain is small, but because it is too large to wear on the surface. She had driven 3 hours from Richmond that morning alone. The highway had been quiet. She had not turned on the radio. Somewhere around Charlottesville, the landscape shifted from suburban sprawl to open pasture, and she had rolled down the window to breathe in the smell of cut hay and damp soil. It was the smell of her childhood. The smell of weekends at her grandmother's farm, of mornings spent collecting eggs while Vivienne hummed old hymns from the kitchen. Now Vivienne was gone. 94 years of living, and what remained was a closed casket beneath white lilies. A church full of people who claimed to have loved her, and the faint scent of lavender that Margery swore she could still detect on the collar of the black dress she had chosen for today. A dress Vivienne had once complimented years ago during a visit that lasted 3 days and felt like 3 hours. Around her, the church murmured with quiet conversations. Cousins she hadn't seen in years leaned toward each other in the pews. Old neighbors dabbed their eyes. A few of Vivienne's former employees stood near the back, uncomfortable in borrowed suits, holding their hats against their chests. And then there was Theo. Her younger brother sat 4 seats to her left, separated by 2 cousins and an aunt. He was 59. His suit was charcoal gray, tailored, expensive, in a way that didn't need to announce itself but somehow always did. His silver watch caught the candlelight each time he lifted his wrist to check the hour. He received every handshake and whispered condolence with the practiced ease of a man who had spent decades in conference rooms and closing dinners across Washington, D.C. Even now, Theo looked like he was managing a transaction, processing the grief efficiently, filing it in the appropriate compartment, moving on to the next. Margery did not judge him for it. People grieve differently. She knew that, but she noticed it the way she had always noticed the distance between them. Not hostile, not cold, just permanent, like 2 trees growing from the same root system, but reaching toward opposite ends of the sky. The service ended with a hymn Vivienne had chosen herself, "Abide with Me." The congregation sang it slowly, and Margery closed her eyes and let the words move through her without trying to hold them. When the last note faded, the minister invited everyone to the Hollowell family home on Elm Street for the reading of the will. The house was a wide, white-columned colonial that Vivienne had purchased in 1971 with money she earned selling apples from the farm. Or so the family story went. Whether that was entirely true, no one could say for certain. Vivienne had always been a woman of selective truths. She told you what she wanted you to know, and she told it so warmly that you never thought to ask about the rest. The living room filled quickly. Someone had arranged folding chairs in rows facing a mahogany desk, where a man named Arthur Pemberton now sat adjusting his glasses. Pemberton was Vivienne's attorney. He had handled her affairs for over 30 years. His white hair was thin, his hands were steady, and when he opened the leather folder in front of him, the room went silent with a swiftness that revealed what everyone had really come for. Not the hymns, not the memories, the will. Pemberton began with the smaller bequests, a donation to the Waynesboro Community Library, a modest sum to the volunteer fire department, personal items left to longtime friends, a pearl brooch to one, a set of first edition novels, to another a handwritten recipe collection, to the woman who had cleaned the house every Thursday for 22 years. These gestures surprised no one. Vivienne had always been generous with loyalty. Then Pemberton turned the page and the air in the room changed. Theodore Hollowell would receive 3 residential properties, 2 in Arlington, 1 in Alexandria, all located in neighborhoods where the average home value exceeded $1.5 million. He would also receive the contents of 4 investment accounts, a portfolio of corporate bonds, and access to 2 trust funds that Vivienne had quietly managed for decades. The combined value, Pemberton noted in his measured voice, was substantial. He did not say the exact number. He did not need to. For a moment, no one spoke. Then came the murmurs. Small, careful, restrained, but unmistakable. A cousin near the window nodded slowly. Another exchanged a glance with her husband. Theo sat very still, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the desk. He was trying not to smile. Margery could see it, the effort it took, the discipline. But behind the composure, satisfaction radiated from him like heat from a stone that had been sitting in the sun all afternoon. Before Pemberton had even finished, a few relatives leaned over to shake Theo's hand. Quiet congratulations, discreet pats on the shoulder, as if the reading of the will were a graduation ceremony, and Theo had just been called to the stage. Then came her name. Pemberton adjusted his glasses once more, turned to the next section, and read aloud a single paragraph that would change the direction of Margery Hollowell's life. The sole and exclusive heir to the property known as Hollow Creek Farm, located in Augusta County, Virginia, comprising approximately 80 acres of land, and all structures therein shall be Margery Elaine Hollowell. Nothing else. No investment accounts, no trust funds, no properties in desirable zip codes, just the farm. The silence that followed was different from the one that had greeted Theo's inheritance. That silence had been filled with admiration, even envy. This one carried a different texture, entirely confusion, discomfort. Something close to pity. A cousin named Darlene was the first to speak, though she directed her words to the woman beside her, not to Margery. That seems a little uneven, doesn't it? Another relative responded quickly. Well, Theo has always had a head for money. Several people nodded. Margery could feel their eyes moving toward her, then away like headlights sweeping past a roadside accident. Then came a voice from somewhere near the back of the room, an aunt perhaps, or an older cousin. The words were spoken just loud enough to carry. Maybe Vivienne didn't think Margery could handle that kind of responsibility. No one disagreed. Margery sat perfectly still. Her hands remained folded. Her face remained composed. But inside her chest something shifted. Not anger, not yet, but a quiet rearrangement of the way she understood her place in this family. She had spent 30 years teaching American history to high school students in Richmond. She had raised 2 children largely on her own after her husband's death. She had managed budget-navigated school board politics, mentored hundreds of teenagers through the most turbulent years of their lives. And yet here in this room, surrounded by people who shared her blood, the consensus seemed to be that she was incapable of handling anything of value. Theo approached her after the reading. He placed a hand on her shoulder, and for one brief second, she thought he might say something kind. Don't worry about it, Marge. That farm's probably worth something. Maybe you can sell it quick, get yourself a nice trip somewhere. She looked at him. There was no cruelty in his voice, no malice. Just a man who genuinely believed she had received a consolation prize. The hours that followed were uncomfortable in a way that settled into her bones. Conversations orbited around Theo's new properties, his investment portfolio, his plans. Relatives circled him with questions, suggestions, business cards. Meanwhile, not a single person asked Margery about the farm. When it was mentioned at all, it was spoken of the way you might speak of a medical bill. An unfortunate obligation, something to resolve and forget. She drove home that evening with the windows down again, even though the October air had turned cold. The highway was dark. The headlights carved tunnels through the Blue Ridge night. On the passenger seat sat a manila envelope containing the deed to Hollow Creek Farm, along with several documents she had not yet read. When she arrived at her small house on the quiet street in Richmond's West End, she did not turn on the television. She did not call anyone. She sat at her kitchen table, placed a framed photograph of Vivienne in front of her. The one taken on the farmhouse porch in 1986, Vivienne laughing, a glass of sweet tea in one hand, the Shenandoah ridgeline glowing amber behind her, and she stared at it for a long time. Something did not add up. Vivienne Hollowell had never been careless. She did not make decisions on impulse. She planned, she calculated. She played the long game in everything from the apple orchards she cultivated in the 1960s to the investments she quietly built over 5 decades. A woman like that does not divide her estate unevenly by accident. She does it on purpose. But why? The question stayed with Margery through the night and into the following days. She slept poorly. She ate without appetite. Phone calls arrived from relatives, and every one of them ended the same way. Have you thought about selling? You really should sell. There's no point holding onto a place like that. Meanwhile, the news about Theo traveled fast. He had already engaged a team of financial advisors. He was photographed at a fundraiser in Georgetown. A cousin reported that he had purchased a new car, German black, the kind that whispered rather than roared. The family's center of gravity had shifted entirely toward him, and the pull was magnetic. Invitations multiplied. Phone calls increased. Everyone, it seemed, wanted to stand in the warmth of Theo's good fortune. Margery stood in nobody's warmth. She stood in her kitchen holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold, staring at the manila envelope she still hadn't fully opened. It was her friend Rosa who finally asked the right question. Rosa had known her since their 20s. They had taught at the same school for 15 years. She came over on a Tuesday afternoon with a casserole and a directness that Margery had always appreciated. Have you actually been to the farm? Margery shook her head. So you don't even know what you inherited. Those words remained in the room long after Rosa left. They hovered above the kitchen table like smoke. That night, Margery opened the envelope. She spread the documents across the table and read every page. The farm was larger than she had imagined, 80 acres, stretching across a wide section of the valley floor, bordered on one side by a creek and on the other by a forested ridge. Several structures were registered on the property. The main house, 2 barns, a storage facility, a workshop, and something listed only as auxiliary building northeast quadrant. But the financial reports were grim. Unpaid property taxes spanning several years, accumulated maintenance costs, a county notice about structural violations. On paper, the farm was a disaster. And yet, Vivienne had held on to it. For decades. She had sold other properties, liquidated other assets, made calculated decisions about every piece of her portfolio. But she never sold Hollow Creek Farm, even when it bled money, even when it sat empty, even when it made no financial sense whatsoever. Why keep this one thing above all others? Margery looked at the photograph again. Vivienne on the porch. The laughter. The light. The valley stretching out behind her like a promise. The next morning, Margery packed a small bag, placed the documents in a folder on the passenger seat, and drove west toward the Blue Ridge. The drive took just under 3 hours. As she left the interstate and turned onto the 2-lane roads that wound through the foothills, the world outside her windshield softened. Strip malls gave way to hayfields. Traffic lights disappeared. The houses grew farther apart, older, quieter, until eventually the road turned to gravel, and the only sound was the crunch of stone beneath her tires. She found the entrance by the rusted iron gate leaning against a stone post. The name Hollow Creek was barely visible beneath years of oxidation and climbing ivy. She got out of the car and pushed the gate open. The hinges screamed. The driveway stretched ahead through a corridor of overgrown oaks whose branches met overhead, forming a tunnel that blocked most of the sky. At the end of it stood the house. It must have been beautiful once. The bones were there, wide wraparound porch, tall windows, a stone chimney rising from the center like a spine. But time had done its work. The porch sagged on the left side. Several windows were cracked or missing entirely. The white paint had peeled away in long strips, revealing the gray wood beneath like old skin. Virginia creeper had climbed the eastern wall and reached the roofline, its tendrils gripping the gutters like fingers. Margery stood in the yard and listened. There were no machines running, no animals, no voices. Only the wind pushing through the dry grass and a single crow calling from somewhere deep in the tree line. She climbed the porch steps, carefully testing each one before committing her weight. The front door was swollen shut from moisture. She leaned into it with her shoulder, and it opened with a groan that echoed through the empty rooms beyond. Inside, the air was thick with dust and age. Sheets covered the furniture, pale shapes in the dim light like ghosts frozen mid-conversation. Cobwebs stretched between the ceiling beams. The floorboards creaked beneath every step, but the photographs were still on the walls. Margery moved slowly through the rooms, studying each one. A black and white image of workers standing beside a tractor, all of them smiling. A color photograph of a summer gathering, long tables covered in food, children running in the background. Vivienne at the center, younger, radiant, gesturing with both hands, as though telling a story that required her whole body. And near the kitchen doorway, a small frame picture of the valley, taken from the ridge above the farm. The fields impossibly green, the creek catching the light like a vein of silver. These photographs told a story of abundance, of purpose, of life happening in every corner of the land. The contrast with what surrounded her now, the silence, the decay, the overwhelming smell of neglect, was almost unbearable. She spent the afternoon walking the property. The barns were listing badly. One had lost a section of roof. The storage buildings were full of rusted equipment, broken tools, and feed sacks that had turned to powder. She found fences that had collapsed under the weight of fallen branches, and a workshop whose floor had partially given way, leaving a dark gap that smelled of earth and rot. Every new discovery confirmed what the family had told her. This place was not a fortune. It was a burden. She returned to the house as the sun began to drop behind the ridgeline. The light came through the broken windows in long gold shafts, catching the dust. She had stirred with her footsteps, turning it into something almost beautiful. Tiny particles suspended in the air, drifting without direction, waiting. She decided to clean the upstairs bedroom before leaving, not because she planned to stay, but because something in her, the teacher, perhaps the woman who had spent her career bringing order to chaos, could not leave a place in worse condition than she found it. The room was small and plain. A brass bed frame, a nightstand, a wash basin, and against the far wall a heavy oak armoire that looked as though it had been standing there since the house was built. Margery tried to move it, to sweep behind it. It resisted. The thing must have weighed 200 pounds. She braced her feet against the floor, gripped the side panel, and pulled. It shifted an inch, then 2. She pulled again, 3 inches. Enough to notice something wrong. The armoire was not flush against the wall. She paused, looked more closely. There was a gap, not large but deliberate, as if the piece had been positioned to conceal something, rather than simply placed for convenience. Her pulse quickened, though she could not have said why. She pulled harder. The armoire scraped across the floorboards with a sound that filled the room. And there behind it, set into the wall at waist height, was a small door. It was no more than 2 feet tall, made of the same wood as the wall paneling, with a brass handle no bigger than a draw pull. If the armoire had been flush, you would never have known it existed. Margery knelt down. Her knees protested. She wrapped her hand around the handle and pulled. The door held swollen tight in its frame. She pulled again, harder, and felt it give a crack, a release of stale air. And then it swung open into darkness. Inside was a compartment built into the wall's cavity. Not a room, a hiding place. carefully constructed, lined with cedar, protected from moisture and insects. On the small shelf within, she found a wooden box unadorned with no lock. She lifted the lid. 5 envelopes arranged in order, cream-colored, heavy paper, and on the front of each in handwriting, she recognized as surely as her own heartbeat a single line for Margery, open in order. She took the first envelope. Her hands were not steady. She sat on the edge of the brass bed, the springs groaning beneath her, and opened it with the care of someone handling something irreplaceable. The letter was written in Vivienne's hand, that elegant, slightly slanted script that Margery had seen on birthday cards, grocery lists, and Christmas notes for over 6 decades. But this was different. These words had weight. They had been chosen. My dearest Margery, if you are reading this, then you have come to the farm instead of selling it. That tells me everything I needed to know. You listen to your instincts, not to the noise. This farm is not a burden. It is a promise I made to this valley a long time ago. A promise I was never able to keep on my own. I am asking you to keep it for me. Do not sell this place. Not yet. Not until you understand what it truly is. There are things hidden here that I could not trust to lawyers, bankers, or even to family members who measure everything in dollars. I have left them for you and only for you, because I know you will look where others refuse to look. The door worth opening is never the obvious one. With all my love, Vivienne. Margery read the letter 3 times. Then she pressed it flat against her chest and held it there as though the ink might seep through the paper and reach her directly. Outside, the last light of the day moved across the valley floor, like a slow wave retreating from a shore. The broken window let in a draught that stirred the dust around her feet. Somewhere in the walls of the old house, a timber settled with a low creak. The way old houses do, not breaking, just breathing, adjusting to the weight of another day, survived. She looked at the 4 remaining envelopes in the box. She looked at the hidden door still open in the wall. She looked at the valley through the cracked glass, the ridgeline turning purple against the fading sky. Every person in her family had told her this place was worthless. Her grandmother, the sharpest woman she had ever known, had told her the opposite. And for the first time since the funeral, Margery Hollowell felt something she had not expected to feel in this broken, forgotten place. Not sadness, not obligation, certainty. She was not going to sell the farm. She was going to find out what Vivienne had hidden and why she had trusted her above everyone else to be the one who found it. The wind picked up outside, moving through the empty barns and across the overgrown fields, carrying with it the faint, impossible scent of lavender. She did not leave the farm that night. The decision was not dramatic. There was no moment of resolve, no clenched fist, no grand declaration to the empty house. She simply could not bring herself to drive away, not with 4 unopened envelopes sitting in a cedar-lined compartment behind a wall that had kept its secret for God knows how long. So she swept the upstairs bedroom with a broom. She found leaning against the pantry door, spread her coat over the bare mattress, and lay down in the brass bed where her grandmother had probably slept decades ago. The house creaked and settled around her through the night. Wind pressed against the windows. Somewhere below, a shutter knocked against its frame in a rhythm that almost sounded intentional, like a hand tapping on wood, asking to be let in. She slept in fragments, 20 minutes here, 40 there. And each time she woke, the envelopes were the first thing she thought of. By dawn, she had already opened the second one. This letter was shorter, more precise. Vivienne's handwriting was tighter here, the strokes faster, as though she had written it in a single sitting, without pausing. Walk north from the main house until you reach the stone barn with the collapsed roof. On the eastern interior wall near the floor, you will find a star carved into the rock. Below the star is a date. Below the date, the stone moves. What you find there will begin to explain everything. Margery folded the letter carefully, tucked it into her jacket pocket, and stepped outside into the kind of morning that only the Shenandoah Valley knows how to make cold air pale gold light mist, rising from the creek in slow white ribbons that dissolve before they reach the treetops. The mountains on both sides of the valley were still in shadow, but the ridgeline to the east had caught the first sun and it burned along the edge like a lit fuse. She walked north. The stone barn was easy to find. It was the larger of the two she had noticed during her first walk around the property. A heavy, squat structure built from fieldstone, its roof partially caved in on one side, exposing the interior to weather and birds. Margery ducked under a sagging beam and stepped inside. The floor was packed earth damp from the collapsed section where rain had been entering freely for years. Old feed troughs lined one wall. Rusted chains hung from iron hooks. A sparrow startled at her entrance and shot through a gap in the stonework, the sound of its wings sharp in the stillness. She began searching the eastern wall. The stones were rough, uneven, fitted together without mortar in the old Appalachian style. She ran her fingers along the lower courses, feeling for anything unusual. The cold seeped into her knuckles. After 15 minutes, her back ached and her fingertips were numb, and she had found nothing. She sat back on her heels and looked at the wall with different eyes, not as a searcher, as a teacher. How would she tell a student to approach a primary source that refused to give up its meaning? Slow down. Change your angle. Look for what does not belong. She shifted to the far corner and started again, this time using her phone's flashlight held close to the surface. The light caught every groove and shadow. Most were natural cracks from frost-lichened stains, the marks of tools used 100 years ago. But near the base, partially hidden behind a fallen stone, she saw it. A five-pointed star no larger than a quarter, carved with deliberate precision into the face of a single stone. Below it, a date, 1987. The numbers were shallow but unmistakable. Her hands trembled as she pressed on the carved stone. Nothing happened. She tried the stone beside it. Nothing. She tried the one below, and this time felt a slight give, a fraction of movement that was not natural settling, but mechanical. She pushed harder. A click, small and definite like a latch releasing inside a wall. 3 inches to the left, a flagstone on the floor shifted upward, rising just enough to get her fingers beneath it. She pried it up. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed inside a metal tube, she found a collection of documents that smelled faintly of cedar and machine oil. Margery carried the tube back to the house and spread its contents across the kitchen table. The morning light through the east-facing window gave everything a warm cast, and for a moment the kitchen looked almost alive again. Papers where plates should be, purpose where emptiness had been. The documents were dense. Technical language diagrams, financial projections, soil analyses, water table studies. At first, she understood very little, but certain words appeared again and again, circled in red ink by Vivienne's hand, underlined, starred. Community development, sustainable agriculture, regional employment initiative, training programs for rural families, and at the top of the oldest document, a name written in block letters: the Hollow Creek Project. Margery leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. Her grandmother, the woman everyone in the family remembered as a sharp-tongued apple farmer with a talent for saving money, had spent decades secretly designing a comprehensive development plan for the entire Shenandoah Valley. Not a business, not a profit scheme, a community transformation. The scope was staggering. Margery spent the next 2 hours reading, and with each page the project grew larger. Vivienne had commissioned agricultural studies, consulted engineers, met with economists, corresponded with university researchers. She had mapped every acre of the farm and identified which sections could support what kind of activity, crops here, livestock training there, a processing facility along the creek workshop spaces in the restored barns. The vision extended beyond the property lines. Partnerships with neighboring farms, supply chains connecting small producers to regional markets. Apprenticeship programs for young people who had been leaving the valley for decades because there was nothing to keep them. It was enormous, it was detailed, and it had never been completed. Margery needed someone who could help her understand why. She found Odette by accident, or perhaps by the kind of design that only small towns can produce, where information travels not through wires, but through glances, through the way a stranger's name is repeated at the post office counter until it reaches the right ears. Margery had driven into the nearest town, a two-stoplight place called Churchville, to buy cleaning supplies and groceries. The hardware store owner asked if she was the one staying out at Hollow Creek. She said she was. He nodded slowly the way people do when they are deciding how much to say, and told her she might want to stop by the cafe on Main Street and ask for Odette. The cafe was called Ridgeline. It occupied the ground floor of a brick building that had probably been a general store a century ago. Inside 6 tables, a counter, and the smell of coffee that had been brewing since before dawn. Behind the counter stood a woman in her late 40s who looked up when Margery entered, but said nothing. Margery ordered coffee and sat near the window. She was about to ask about Odette when a voice reached her from the table behind. "You're Vivienne's granddaughter." She turned. The woman sitting there was small and thin, with white hair pulled back from a face that held more sharpness than softness. Her eyes were dark, attentive, and carried the unmistakable quality of someone who had been watching the door for a long time. "I'm Odette Birch. I worked with your grandmother for almost 20 years. Margery moved to her table. For the next 2 hours she listened. Odette spoke carefully, choosing each word the way a carpenter chooses nails. Nothing wasted, nothing decorative, everything functional. She had met Vivienne in 1985 when both women served on a county agricultural board. They had recognized something in each other immediately. Not friendship exactly, but alignment. A shared conviction that the valley was dying slowly and that no one with the power to stop it seemed interested in trying. Your grandmother was the one with the vision. I was the one who knew how to talk to people. Between the two of us, we got a lot done. What kind of things? Odette sipped her coffee. Small things at first. A seed-sharing program, a equipment co-op so families didn't have to buy their own combines. Then it grew. Vivienne started bringing in experts, soil scientists, water engineers, folks from the Agriculture Extension Office. She was building something. The Hollow Creek Project. Odette set down her cup. "So you found the papers, some of them." The older woman studied her for a long moment. Then she said something that Margery would remember for the rest of her life. "Your grandmother changed a lot of lives around here. Quietly. Without anyone outside the valley ever knowing. Then one day everything stopped. The meetings ended. The experts stopped coming. Vivienne pulled back completely. Nobody understood why. What happened?" Odette's expression tightened. "People happened. The wrong kind of people." She did not elaborate, not then. But she offered to visit the farm the following day, and Margery accepted without hesitation. That evening, sitting alone in the farmhouse kitchen, Margery opened the 3rd envelope. If you are reading this, it means you are still trusting your instincts. Not everyone will understand what you are about to discover. Some will try to stop you. Do not let fear make you quit. She read the line again. Some will try to stop you. The words settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Not a splash, but a slow spreading weight. Odette arrived the next morning in a pickup truck that was older than most of the trees along the driveway. She brought a cardboard box and a thermos of coffee. The box contained photographs, newspaper clippings, and documents she had kept in her own home for over 30 years. They spread everything across the kitchen table alongside Margery's own findings. For the first time, the fragments began to form a coherent picture. Among Odette's photographs was one that stopped Margery cold. It showed Vivienne at roughly 45 years old, standing before a gathering of perhaps 60 people in what appeared to be a community hall. She was mid-gesture, one hand raised, her face illuminated by the kind of certainty that cannot be performed. Beside her stood a tall man in a dark suit, handsome, composed, smiling broadly for the camera. "That's Harlan Tanner," Odette said quietly. "He was her partner in the beginning. Brought money, connections, credibility. Everyone thought they made a perfect team. What went wrong?" Odette turned the photograph over. On the back, in Vivienne's handwriting, was a single line, the beginning of the end. Odette sat down heavily. Harlan didn't want to help the valley. He wanted to own it. Vivienne figured that out too late, or maybe just late enough. By the time she cut ties with him, he'd already gotten access to parts of the project she never intended to share. What parts? Financial projections, land assessments, water rights studies, everything that would let someone calculate exactly how much the valley was worth if you developed it the right way or the wrong way. Margery felt the air in the kitchen change as though a door had opened somewhere in the house and let in a draft from a direction she hadn't anticipated. Does Harlan Tanner have family? Odette looked at her. A son. Name's Cresswell, goes by Cress, businessman out of D.C. Very polished, very patient. The name meant nothing to Margery, not yet. While Margery was kneeling on cold stone floors and reading her grandmother's secrets by flashlight, Theo Hollowell was sitting in a private dining room at a restaurant in Georgetown, listening to a man he had met only 6 weeks earlier explain how to double the value of his inheritance within 18 months. Cresswell Tanner was everything Theo aspired to be, measured, confident, effortlessly connected. He wore his wealth without displaying it. He referenced senators by first name and discussed market movements the way other people discussed weather. He had appeared in Theo's life through a mutual acquaintance at a real estate conference and within days had positioned himself as the most valuable person in Theo's orbit. The advice started small. Rebalance this account. Move that property into an LLC for tax efficiency. Consider this private equity fund. The returns have been extraordinary. Theo listened. Theo signed. Theo did not read every page because the man sitting across from him radiated the kind of competence that makes due diligence feel like an insult. Within 2 months, Theo had redirected a significant portion of his inherited wealth into investment vehicles that Cress had recommended. The early returns looked promising. The statements showed growth. The future, according to Cress, was nothing but upward trajectory and compounding returns. Theo bought a second car. He renovated the Arlington property. He took a trip to the Amalfi Coast and posted photographs that made his cousins comment with envy. He was living at last the life he believed he had always deserved. He did not notice that the statements he received were generated by a firm he had never independently verified. He did not notice that the fund structures were unusually opaque. And he did not notice that every conversation with Cress, no matter how casually it began, eventually circled back to the same subject. So your sister's still out at that old farm. 3 weeks after discovering the documents in the stone barn, Margery was woken in the middle of the night by a sound that did not belong to the house. She had been sleeping better by then. The rhythm of the farm had begun to settle into her body. Early mornings, long days of physical work. Evenings spent reading documents by lamplight. She had cleaned 4 rooms of the house, repaired the porch railing with lumber, donated anonymously by someone in Churchville who left it stacked by the gate with no note, and begun cataloging the project files in a system that would have made her old-school librarian proud. The rain that night was heavy. It hammered the tin roof in sheets and the wind drove it sideways against the windows. Margery was accustomed to the sounds the house made in storms, the shutter that knocked the beam that groaned, the particular whistle of air through the crack in the upstairs hallway window. This sound was different, a thud, then a scrape, then silence. She lay still listening. Her heartbeat was the loudest thing in the room. Then it came again, movement downstairs near the kitchen. The creak of a floorboard under a weight that was not hers. She rose slowly, took the flashlight from the nightstand, stepped into the hallway without turning it on. The darkness was absolute. She moved by memory, one hand on the wall, counting door frames until she reached the stairs. At the bottom, a faint gray rectangle, the kitchen doorway illuminated by whatever ambient light leaked through the windows. She waited, listened, heard nothing more. She turned on the light. The back door was open. Rain was blowing in across the kitchen floor, pooling against the baseboards. The table where she had organized 2 weeks of carefully sorted documents was in disarray folders. Opened papers scattered, several stacks missing entirely. Margery moved quickly through the house, checking every room. No one was there. Whoever had entered had already left. She returned to the kitchen, and began assessing the damage. Most of the documents remained, but the gaps were precise. Specific folders had been taken, the ones containing the most recent records, the financial projections, the correspondence from the final years of the project. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were looking for. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, rain still blowing through the open door, her bare feet cold on the wet floor, and felt something she had not felt since the funeral. Not grief this time, not confusion. Anger clean, sharp, and clarifying, like the first frost of autumn that kills what is weak and reveals what is strong. She closed the door. She locked it. She dried the floor. And then she sat down and began making copies of every remaining document by photographing each page with her phone. It took until dawn. She did not stop. The next morning she drove to Churchville and filed a report with the county sheriff. A deputy came to the farm, noted the forced entry, observed the tire tracks on the mud road, 2 sets recent, consistent with a vehicle that had approached from the south gate, and told her honestly that without cameras or witnesses, the chances of identifying the intruder were slim. Margery thanked him. She had not expected a solution from the sheriff's office. She had expected confirmation, and she got it. Someone else was interested in the Hollow Creek project. Someone who preferred to operate in the dark. When she returned to the farm, she found something she had missed in the chaos of the night. A small envelope had been slipped beneath the front door. No stamp, no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "Stop looking. Sell the property while you still can." She read it twice, folded it, placed it in the box with the other documents. And then she walked out to the porch, sat in the chair where Vivienne used to sit, and watched the valley emerge from the morning fog with the patience of a woman who had decided completely and finally that she was not going anywhere. Odette came by that afternoon. When Margery told her about the break-in and the note, the older woman's face went very still. "Then they've started again. Who the people who killed the project the first time?" Odette paused, and in the silence the weight of what she had not yet said became visible, a tightening around her mouth, a shift in her posture, as though she were physically bracing against a memory. "Your grandmother didn't just abandon the project, Margery. She buried it. She hid every important document because she discovered that someone was systematically trying to take control not just of the project, but of the land itself. The studies Vivienne commissioned proved that this valley, managed correctly, could sustain an entire regional economy. That information was worth a fortune to the right people, or the wrong ones." Margery thought of the name Odette had mentioned days earlier. Cresswell Tanner. Does he know what's in these files? Odette looked at her steadily. His father spent years trying to find out. I imagine the son hasn't stopped. That afternoon, Margery returned to the documents with a focus that bordered on obsession. She had been reading them as history. Now she read them as evidence. Cross-referencing dates, tracking names, following the paper trail that Vivienne had carefully preserved. And there in a notebook she had initially set aside as routine bookkeeping, she found something that changed everything. A set of entries from the final active year of the project described a secondary archive, a complete repository of the most sensitive materials stored in a location Vivienne had constructed specifically to survive exactly the kind of interference that was now occurring. The entry referenced the auxiliary building listed on the property deed, northeast quadrant. The structure Margery had walked past several times without giving it a second thought. A low stone building, half buried in the hillside, its entrance nearly invisible beneath years of ivy and fallen branches. She went immediately. The building was smaller than the barns built from the same fieldstone, but with a heavier door metal, not wood, set into a frame that had been engineered to last. The lock was old but solid. She tried the key she had found inside the metal tube from the stone barn. It fit. The door opened inward with a resistance that spoke of weight and intention. Behind it, a narrow set of stone steps descended into the hillside. The air that rose to meet her was cool, dry, and carried a faint mineral smell, not decay but preservation. The temperature underground was constant. The walls had been lined with something, a vapor barrier perhaps, or a waterproof membrane. This was not a root cellar. This was a vault. At the bottom of the steps, Margery found a room roughly the size of a two-car garage carved into the hillside and reinforced with concrete and steel shelving. Filing cabinets lined three walls. Boxes were stacked neatly on metal racks. A large table occupied the center, and on it sat several bound folders, each labeled in Vivienne's handwriting. She had been inside the hidden compartment behind the armoire. She had been inside the stone barn's secret hollow. But this was something else entirely. This was the heart of it, the place where Vivienne had gathered everything she could not afford to lose. Margery moved through the room slowly, pulling files, scanning pages, absorbing the scale of what her grandmother had built and buried. Complete engineering reports, water rights analyses, agricultural yield projections spanning 50 years, contracts with universities, letters from state officials expressing interest in the project, financial models showing how the initiative could become self-sustaining within a decade. And then, in a steel cabinet in the far corner, she found a folder marked in red ink with a single word: confidential. Inside were records of a different kind: meeting minutes documenting disputes, legal correspondence referencing unauthorized access to project materials, internal memos warning of conflicts of interest, and a list of names, individuals who had attempted to gain control of the project through financial pressure, legal maneuvering, and in some cases, outright deception. The first name on the list was Harlan Tanner. The second was a company called Blue Ridge Horizon Partners, LLC. The third, added later in fresher ink in handwriting that was slightly less steady than the rest, as though Vivienne's hand had aged between entries, was Cresswell Tanner. Margery stared at the page. The underground room was silent except for the faint hum of air moving through whatever ventilation system Vivienne had installed. The light from her flashlight made the red ink glow. Father and son, decades apart. The same target, the same method. Patient, methodical, relentless. And now Cress Tanner was sitting across dinner tables from her brother, pouring wine and offering advice. And Theo had no idea that the man helping him invest his fortune was the same man who had spent years trying to destroy their grandmother's life work. Margery placed the folder back in the cabinet. She climbed the stone steps. She pushed the heavy door shut behind her and locked it. The evening air hit her face, cool, sharp, tinged with wood smoke from somewhere down the valley. She stood on the hillside and looked out over the farm. The last light was draining from the sky. The field stretched below her, overgrown and wild, but no longer lifeless, not to her, not anymore. She could see them now the way Vivienne had seen them, not as they were, but as they could be. She needed to warn Theo. She needed to tell him who Cresswell Tanner really was, what he wanted, and how long his family had been circling this land like something patient and predatory waiting for the fence to come down. She pulled out her phone and dialed her brother's number. It rang 4 times. 5, 6, no answer. She tried again 20 minutes later. Again, nothing. A third attempt, an hour after that, straight to voicemail. Theo's recorded voice, cheerful and unhurried, the voice of a man who still believed he was winning. Margery lowered the phone and stood in the dark outside the farmhouse door, listening to the valley settle into night. The creek murmured below the ridge. An owl called once from the tree line, then fell silent. Somewhere in Washington, her brother was sitting in a room with a man whose family had spent 40 years trying to take everything their grandmother had built. And he did not know it. And she could not reach him. And the door worth opening, the one that mattered most now, was not hidden behind a wall or buried beneath a stone. It was the door between two people who shared the same blood, but had stopped being able to hear each other a long time ago. She did not know yet whether that door could still be opened. She only knew that she had to try, and that the longer she waited, the less there might be left to save. She drove to Washington the next morning, 3 hours on I-64 through the Blue Ridge, then north on I-81. the landscape shifting from valley farmland to suburban sprawl to the dense, self-important architecture of the capital. She had not called ahead. She had not texted. Theo was not answering his phone, and the reasons for his silence mattered less than what she carried in the folder on the passenger seat. 40 years of evidence that the man advising her brother was the son of the man who had tried to destroy their grandmother's life work. She arrived at Theo's Arlington townhouse just after noon. His new car sat in the driveway, black and polished, catching the autumn sun. She rang the bell. No answer. She rang again, then knocked. After a full minute, the door opened. Theo looked like a man who had been sleeping in his clothes. His shirt was wrinkled. His eyes were ringed with shadow. The townhouse behind him, which he had never visited but imagined would be immaculate, smelled of coffee that had been reheated too many times, and something else, the stale, closed-in air of a room where curtains have not been opened in days. Marge, what are you doing here? You haven't answered your phone in 4 days. He stepped aside to let her in. The living room was cluttered with papers, bank statements, legal documents, printed emails spread across the dining table and the floor beside it. A laptop sat open on the couch, its screen showing a spreadsheet dense with red numbers. Margery did not ask what had happened. She could see it. The room told the story the way a crime scene tells a story, not with a single dramatic revelation, but with the accumulation of small damning details. An overdue notice from a mortgage company, a letter from an investment firm requesting immediate contact, a legal filing she recognized as a demand for payment on a margin call. Theo stood in the middle of it all, and for the first time since they were children, he looked at her without any pretense of control. I think I've made a mistake. He told her everything. The investments Cress had recommended, private equity funds, development partnerships, bridge loans for projects that existed only on paper. The early returns that looked so convincing. The slow realization arriving in stages like water, seeping through a crack in a foundation that the returns had stopped, then reversed, then disappeared entirely. 3 separate ventures had collapsed within weeks of each other. A 4th was under investigation. The combined losses accounted for more than half of what he had inherited. Margery listened without interrupting. She watched her brother's hands as he spoke, the way they gripped the back of a dining chair. The knuckles white, the fingers of a man holding on to the last solid thing in a room where the floor was giving way. When he finished, she placed her folder on the table. I need to show you something. She opened it to the first page, the confidential list from Vivienne's underground archive. Harlan Tanner, Blue Ridge Horizon Partners, Cresswell Tanner. Theo stared at the names. His jaw moved slightly as though he were chewing on something he could not swallow. Margery walked him through it. Slowly, document by document. Harlan Tanner's initial partnership with Vivienne in the 1980s. The gradual power grab. The stolen project materials. Vivienne's decision to sever the relationship and bury the most sensitive files. And then, decades later, the son Cress appearing in Theo's life with the same patience, the same polish, the same long-game strategy his father had used. She did not raise her voice. She did not say, I told you so. She simply laid the evidence on the table and let it speak in the language Theo understood best. Numbers, contracts, names connected by lines of money that flowed in only one direction. When she reached the final document, a memo in Vivienne's handwriting, noting that Cress had attempted to access the farm through intermediaries as recently as 5 years before her death, Theo pushed back from the table and walked to the window. He stood there for a long time. She used me. Margery shook her head. He used you. There's a difference. Is there Vivienne didn't leave you that money because she thought you were weak, Theo. She left it to you because she knew you could handle it. What she didn't predict, what nobody could predict, was that someone who had been waiting 40 years would show up the moment she was gone. Theo pressed his forehead against the glass. Outside, the Arlington street was quiet. Leaf blowers droned somewhere in the distance. A neighbor walked a dog past the townhouse without looking up. What do you want me to do? Margery gathered the documents back into the folder. Come to the farm, not today, when you're ready, but come alone. Don't bring lawyers, don't bring anyone. Just come. He did not answer immediately, but he did not refuse. She drove back to the valley that evening. The return trip felt shorter the way distances always do when you carry less uncertainty. She had delivered the information. The rest was up to Theo. 2 weeks passed. The October hardwoods reached their peak and began to let go, first the maples, then the oaks, then the hickories, each species releasing its hold on a slightly different schedule, as though the valley were undressing slowly layer by layer, preparing for the long patience of winter. Margery kept working. She met with a property attorney in Staunton, who reviewed the farm's deed and confirmed what she had suspected. Vivienne had built the ownership structure with extraordinary care. Multiple layers of legal protection, transfer restrictions that would resist any forced sale, clauses that specifically anticipated external attempts to acquire the property through financial pressure or litigation. Her grandmother had expected this, all of it. The only thing she could not do was fight the battle herself. One morning, Margery found a box of mason jars on the front porch. No note, no name. Just 12-quart jars of applesauce, each one sealed and labeled with a date from the previous fall. She asked Odette about it the next day. That's from the Peyton family. They live about 4 miles south. Their grandmother used to sell apples to Vivienne. Why leave them anonymously? Odette smiled, a rare event, quick and private, like a bird landing on a branch and immediately taking off again. Because around here, people help before they introduce themselves. It's a test. If you accept the help without demanding to know who gave it, you pass. Over the following days, more gifts appeared. A stack of firewood split and seasoned left by the gate. A bag of roofing nails hung from the porch railing. A handwritten note tucked into the mailbox. My husband does plumbing. If you need pipes fixed, call this number. No charge. The valley was watching. And slowly, carefully, in the way that mountain communities have always operated, through observation rather than declaration, it was deciding that Margery Hollowell might be worth trusting. Then Theo came. He arrived on a Friday afternoon in early November alone, driving the older of his 2 cars, the practical one, not the German sedan. Margery saw him from the porch and noted everything she needed to know in the first 5 seconds. The way he closed the car door quietly instead of letting it swing shut. The way he stood in the driveway and looked at the house, really looked at it the way you look at a place when you are trying to see it instead of evaluate it. The way his shoulders sat lower than they had at the funeral, stripped of the rigid architecture of performance. He climbed the porch steps. She handed him a cup of coffee. They sat in the 2 chairs that faced the valley. The same chairs where Vivienne and Odette had sat decades ago, planning a future that never arrived. And for a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was not hostile. It was not strategic. It was the silence of 2 people who had run out of the versions of themselves they had been performing for each other and were sitting for the first time in years with nothing between them but the truth and the view. Theo spoke first. I looked into Cress, hired an independent forensic accountant. You were right. The funds he directed me toward are connected to a network of shell companies, several of which trace back to interests his father established in the late 1980s. The same period grandmother was running the project. Margery nodded. She had expected this. He also made inquiries about the farm, through intermediaries. 2 different offers to purchase the land came through companies that my accountant linked back to Cress's network. Margery took a slow sip of coffee. She watched a red-tailed hawk ride a thermal above the south field, circling without effort, patient and precise. He wasn't just investing your money badly, Theo. He was investing it strategically. Every dollar he moved out of your accounts weakened your position and increased the pressure on both of us. The goal was never the returns. The goal was the farm. Theo set his cup down on the porch railing. His hands were steady now. Whatever trembling had been in them 2 weeks ago in Arlington had been replaced by something harder and quieter. I want to help fix this. Margery looked at him. She studied his face the way she had studied the documents in the underground vault, searching for authenticity, for the thing beneath the surface that could be trusted. She saw it. Faint, bruised, uncertain of itself, but present. Okay. That evening, she took him down the stone steps into the hillside vault. She watched his face as the flashlight swept across the filing cabinets. The research folders, the decades of meticulous work their grandmother had hidden beneath a field that everyone above ground had dismissed as worthless. Theo moved through the room, touching nothing. Reading the labels on the cabinets, absorbing the scope of what he was seeing. When he reached the table at the center, he stopped. On it lay the final folder Margery had not yet opened, a large envelope sealed with Vivienne's handwriting on the front. For Margery, last. She had been saving it, waiting perhaps for a moment that felt complete enough to deserve it. She picked it up, broke the seal, and read aloud. The letter was longer than any of the others. Vivienne's voice came through the words with a clarity that made the underground room feel warm, as though she was standing just beyond the reach of the flashlight, listening. She wrote about the project, how it had begun as a simple idea during a drought year, when she watched 3 families in the valley lose their farms within a single season. She wrote about the years of work, the experts she recruited, the plans she drew on the kitchen table late at night after everyone else had gone to sleep. She wrote about Harlan Tanner and the betrayal that taught her the difference between an investor and an opportunist. And then she wrote about the inheritance. I divided what I had very carefully, and I know it will not look fair to most people. Theo received money because money is what he understands, and I wanted to give him the chance to learn what money cannot do. You received the farm because the farm is what I love most, and I could only trust it to someone who would look past what it appears to be and find what it actually is. This was never a punishment for either of you. It was a test for both of you. The money will test Theo's judgment. The farm will test your patience. What matters is not which test is harder. What matters is what each of you does when the test reveals who you really are. Margery's voice broke on the last line. She stopped reading and pressed the letter against her chest, the same gesture she had made with the first letter weeks ago in the upstairs bedroom, as though the paper itself could carry warmth. Theo stood across the table. His eyes were wet. He did not wipe them. He did not look away. He simply stood there in the underground room their grandmother had built to protect a dream that was 40 years old and still breathing. And he nodded. He did not say he was sorry. He did not need to. The nod carried everything. Recognition, regret, the quiet acceptance of a man who had finally understood that the most valuable thing he had been given was not in any account or portfolio, but was standing in front of him, holding a letter in a vault beneath a farm he had once called worthless. The months that followed moved at the pace the valley demanded, not fast, not slow, but steady. The way a creek moves through limestone, shaping the land without anyone noticing until the canyon is already there. Margery assembled a small team, an agricultural engineer from Virginia Tech, a rural development specialist from the county extension office, Odette, who knew every family in the valley and which doors would open with a knock and which required patience, and Theo, who brought the one skill the project had always lacked, the ability to read a contract structure, a partnership, and negotiate terms that protected everyone at the table instead of just the person at the head. Cresswell Tanner did not disappear quietly. There were legal challenges, claims against the property, disputes over old agreements, attempts to tie the farm up in litigation. Each one was met by the documentation Vivienne had preserved. Every challenge crumbled against the weight of 40 years of meticulous record-keeping. An investigation into Cress's financial activities widened, and one by one the associates who had supported his network began to distance themselves. The circle that had pursued the Hollow Creek project across 2 generations contracted, then collapsed. The farm itself began to change. Not dramatically, not the way a building goes up or a business launches, but the way a garden grows. The main house was repaired, its porch rebuilt, its windows replaced. The stone barn was stabilized and converted into a workshop. The fields nearest the creek were cleared and planted with cover crops to restore the soil. Two families from Churchville joined a pilot program that offered shared access to equipment and training in sustainable growing methods. Small things. The kind of things that do not make headlines, but change the texture of daily life for people who had stopped believing anything would change at all. On a morning in late spring, Margery walked up the hill behind the farmhouse to the spot where the land crested and the entire valley opened below. The grass was new and green. The creek caught the early light. Down by the restored barn, she could hear the sound of a truck engine and voices the Peyton family delivering seedlings for the first community planting. Odette was on the porch, sitting in the chair on the left, a cup of coffee in her hand, watching the activity below with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was something close. The look of a woman seeing something she had given up on a long time ago begin very quietly to happen. Theo was on the phone near the gate speaking with the county planning office about a zoning adjustment that would allow the workshop barn to host training sessions. He spoke differently now, slower. He asked more questions than he answered. Somewhere between Arlington and this valley, between the spreadsheets with red numbers and the stone steps leading underground. He had learned to listen, not because listening was strategic, but because he had finally met a silence that was worth more than anything he could say. Margery stood on the hill and held the last letter in her hand. She did not open it. She knew every word. She had read it so many times that the creases in the paper had softened to the texture of cloth. Below her, the barn door stood open. It was the old stone barn, the one with the star carved into its wall, the one that had held the first hidden tube of documents, the one whose heavy wooden door had resisted her push on that first cold morning when she did not yet know what she was looking for. The door was propped wide now, and the morning light poured through it, falling across the stone floor in a long, warm rectangle that reached all the way to the back wall, where the five-pointed star still held its shallow place in the rock. The door worth opening is never the obvious one. She thought about all the doors she had opened since the funeral. The small one behind the armoire, the metal one in the hillside, the door of her brother's townhouse where she had stood uninvited with a folder full of evidence and no certainty that he would listen, and the one she could not see or touch, the door between two people who had forgotten how to be honest with each other, which had opened not with a key or a latch, but with a letter read aloud underground, while the world above them went on without knowing. Some doors you walk through once, others you hold open for someone else. The wind moved across the hilltop, carrying the smell of fresh-turned earth and creek water, and something faintly sweet apple blossoms from the old orchard at the valley's edge. The trees Vivienne had planted 50 years ago still alive, still blooming, still offering fruit to anyone willing to reach. Margery folded the letter and placed it in her pocket. She stood for another moment watching the light fill the valley, the way water fills a basin, slowly, completely touching everything. Then she walked back down the hill toward the voices, toward the work, toward the life that was growing in a place everyone had once told her was worth nothing. If someone you loved left you something that looked like a burden, something everyone said you should give up, would you have the patience to look deeper? Think about that tonight. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe and come back next week. There are always more doors worth opening.